I'm Olivia Williams, 29, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the lead financial analyst at Meridian Holdings, pulling in 6 figures and on track for partnership. My crime? Being too honest during board meetings when I questioned discrepancies in our quarterly reports. My boss, Derek, called me into his office with that fake sympathetic smile and said, "Olivia, we're restructuring. You're being moved to junior analyst. A 60% pay cut for doing my job correctly." But here's what Derek didn't know. During my 2 years analyzing their books, I discovered something that would make their restructuring look like child's play. Hidden offshore accounts, falsified expense reports, and tax schemes that would make the IRS very interested. They thought demoting me would silence me. They were wrong. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, like if you've ever been punished for doing the right thing. 2 years ago, when I first walked into the glass towers of Meridian Holdings with my Northwestern MBA, still fresh and my student loans still suffocating, I thought I'd found my dream job. The Employee of the Month plaque that used to hang in my corner office before they moved me to a cubicle was proof that I'd earned my place, there through sheer determination and analytical brilliance. I started as a junior analyst, one of 12 fresh graduates competing for attention in a sea of navy suits and ambitious smiles. But numbers spoke to me in ways that seemed almost mystical to my colleagues. While they struggled with complex financial models, I could spot patterns and discrepancies that others missed entirely. Within 6 months, I was presenting directly to senior management. Within a year, I had my own team. Derek Martinez, my boss and the company's chief financial officer, used to call me his secret weapon. He'd lean back in his leather chair during our weekly one-on-ones, fingers steepled, and tell me how impressed the board was with my insights. "Olivia," he'd say, "you have a gift for seeing what others can't. That's why you're going places in this company." My corner office on the 15th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. I could see Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its waters changing from steel gray to brilliant blue, depending on the weather and my mood. That view reminded me daily of how far I'd come from my cramped studio apartment near campus, where I'd survived on ramen noodles and determination. The salary increase from $55,000 to $140,000 when I made lead analyst felt like winning the lottery. Suddenly, I could afford the sleek one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, with its exposed brick walls and modern kitchen where I actually cooked meals instead of microwaving frozen dinners. I bought my first car, a certified pre-owned BMW that made me feel like I belonged in the executive parking garage. More than the money, though, I loved the respect. When I walked into board meetings with my carefully prepared reports, executives would lean forward to listen. My analysis influenced million-dollar decisions. I was the youngest person ever to receive Meridian's Excellence in Analytics Award, and Derek made sure everyone knew it during the company holiday party. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd announced that December evening, champagne glass raised high, "this brilliant young woman saved us from a disastrous acquisition last quarter. Her due diligence uncovered financial irregularities that would have cost us $12 million. The applause that followed felt like validation of every late night I'd spent poring over spreadsheets, every weekend I'd sacrificed to master new analytical software, every moment of imposter syndrome I'd pushed through. I belonged here. I'd earned my place at the table. My colleagues respected my work ethic and analytical precision. Sarah from marketing would stop by my office for advice on budget allocations. Tom from operations trusted my cost-benefit analyzers for his efficiency initiatives. Even the senior partners would nod approvingly when I presented quarterly findings. I thought I understood the company's culture of excellence and integrity. Meridian Holdings prided itself on ethical business practices and transparent financial reporting. Their mission statement, printed on glossy placard in every conference room, emphasized unwavering commitment to honesty and accountability. I believed in those words. They reflected my own values, my own professional standards. During those golden months as lead analyst, I felt invincible. I was building something meaningful, a career based on competence and integrity, a future where my analytical skills would take me to executive leadership. Derek had even hinted at a vice president track, suggesting I start thinking about an executive MBA program. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Sitting in my cramped cubicle on the third floor, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights that never seemed bright enough. That Employee of the Month plaque was probably in some storage closet, gathering dust like my former reputation. The first time I noticed something odd was 6 months ago. During my routine analysis of our third quarter expenses, I was reviewing the quarterly report draft that would eventually go to our board and shareholders, cross-referencing line items against supporting documentation, when a series of consulting fees caught my attention. Meridian Holdings had paid $847,000 to something called Strategic Solutions International, for what the invoices vaguely described as operational consulting services. The amount wasn't unusual. We regularly contracted external consultants for specialized projects. What bothered me was that I couldn't find any corresponding project documentation, meeting notes, or deliverables in our system. I pulled up our vendor database, expecting to find Strategic Solutions International listed with standard contractor information, address, tax ID, contact details, past project history. Instead, I found a bare-bones entry with just a Delaware mailing address and a generic email. No phone number, no website, no history of previous work with our company. My forensic accounting training from Northwestern had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt off. Professor Martinez, no relation to Derek, used to say, if the documentation doesn't tell a story, then someone's hiding the real story. I decided to dig deeper. Late that evening, after most of the office had emptied out, I accessed our accounts payable system to trace the payment. The $847,000 had been transferred to a business account at First Caribbean Bank in the Cayman Islands. My stomach tightened. Why would a Delaware-based consulting firm maintain banking relationships in an offshore tax haven? I printed the relevant documents and spread them across my desk under the harsh fluorescent lights. The invoices from Strategic Solutions International were professionally formatted but oddly generic. No detailed breakdown of services, no hourly rates, no specific deliverables, just broad categories like strategic analysis and operational optimization. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Derek to discuss the quarterly report. I chose my words carefully, framing my concerns as routine due diligence rather than accusations. Derek, I'm reviewing the consulting expenses for Q3, and I noticed some payments that seem a bit unusual. Can you help me understand the Strategic Solutions International project? He barely looked up from his computer screen. Strategic Solutions? They did some competitive analysis work for us. Market research, that kind of thing. I don't see any project files or deliverables in our system. Could you point me to where that documentation might be stored? For the first time, Derek's fingers paused over his keyboard. When he looked at me, his expression had shifted from casual indifference to something more guarded. Those files are confidential, Olivia. Strategic intelligence, you understand. Can't have that information floating around where competitors might access it. Of course, but for financial reporting purposes, I need to properly categorize the expense. The auditors will want to see supporting documentation. The auditors won't question it, Derek said, his tone becoming clipped. These kinds of consulting arrangements are standard in our industry. Your job is to analyze the numbers, not investigate every vendor relationship. The dismissal stung, but more than that, it raised new questions. In my 2 years at Meridian, Derek had never spoken to me with that kind of condescension. He'd always encouraged my thoroughness, praised my attention to detail. Now he seemed irritated by the very qualities that had earned me promotions. Night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the payment to Strategic Solutions International, about Derek's defensive reaction, about the lack of documentation. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Delaware shell companies and offshore banking arrangements. What I learned made my blood run cold. Delaware, incorporation combined with Cayman Islands. Banking was a classic structure for moving money overseas while avoiding U.S. tax obligations. It wasn't necessarily illegal, but it required careful documentation and reporting to comply with international tax regulations. The generic nature of strategic solutions. International's invoices suggested they weren't providing legitimate consulting services at all. Spent the weekend reviewing our financial records from the past year, looking for similar patterns. I found 3 more payments to unfamiliar companies with offshore banking arrangements. Global Advisory Partners, $623,000. International Business Solutions, $731,000. And Worldwide Consulting Group, $445,000. Nearly $2.7 million in total, all paid to entities that seemed to exist only on paper. My hands shook as I documented each discovery in a private notebook I kept at home. This wasn't just suspicious, it looked like systematic tax evasion through fraudulent consulting payments. If I was right, Meridian Holdings was illegally moving millions of dollars overseas to avoid paying U.S. corporate taxes. The ethical implications hit me like a physical blow. I'd built my career on integrity and transparency, believing I worked for a company that shared those values. If my suspicions were correct, then every financial report I'd helped prepare, every board presentation I delivered, had been built on a foundation of lies. But I also knew I couldn't ignore what I'd found. My professional obligations, my personal ethics, and my forensic accounting training all pointed toward the same conclusion. I needed to investigate further. The question was whether Derek's defensive reaction had been an isolated incident, or a warning of what would happen if I kept digging. As it turned out, I was about to find out. My handwritten notes, carefully hidden in my home office filing cabinet, grew thicker each night as I uncovered layer after layer of suspicious transactions. What had started as curiosity about one unusual consulting payment had evolved into a systematic investigation that kept me awake until 3 a.m. Cross-referencing bank records, vendor files, and tax documents, the pattern was sophisticated, but once I understood it, almost insultingly obvious. Meridian Holdings was using a network of shell companies to funnel money overseas, disguising tax evasion as legitimate business expenses. The scheme had been running for at least 3 years, with payments increasing in frequency and amount over time. I created a detailed timeline in my notebook, using different colored pens to track money flows. Blue ink for payments to shell companies, red ink for corresponding transfers to offshore accounts, green ink for the dates when quarterly reports were filed with inflated expense claims. The visual pattern was damning, a rainbow of corporate fraud, spanning dozens of pages. The sophistication of the operation suggested multiple people were involved. These weren't random mistakes or oversights. They were carefully orchestrated financial crimes. Someone had researched international banking laws, established shell companies in Delaware, opened accounts in tax havens, and created a paper trail. Convincing enough to fool external auditors. My forensic accounting training helped me recognize the classic techniques. The amounts were always below reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic government scrutiny. The shell companies had plausible names and legitimate-sounding business descriptions. The invoices included just enough detail to appear authentic, while remaining vague enough to avoid specific accountability. But I could see through the facade. Strategic Solutions International wasn't providing strategic solutions. It was providing a way to make $847,000 disappear from U.S. tax obligations. Global Advisory Partners wasn't advising on global business strategy. It was partnering with Meridian executives to commit international tax fraud. The more I investigated, the more I realized how deeply this corruption had penetrated the company's financial structure. Nearly every quarter showed suspicious payments, and the amounts were escalating. In the most recent quarter, I'd identified $1.2 million in fraudulent consulting fees money that should have been subject to corporate income tax, but had instead vanished into offshore accounts. I estimated that over 3 years, Meridian Holdings had evaded approximately $4.3 million in federal taxes through this scheme. That didn't include state taxes, interest, or penalties that would be assessed if the IRS discovered the fraud. The company was looking at potential liability of $12 to $15 million, not to mention criminal charges for the executives involved. Personal toll of my investigation was becoming obvious. I'd lost weight from stress and poor eating habits. My apartment, usually meticulously organized, had become cluttered with printed documents and research materials. I'd cancelled social plans and avoided calls from friends who wanted to know why I seemed so distracted lately. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed replaying conversations with Derek, analyzing his reactions to my questions, wondering how long the fraud had been going on, and who else might be involved. The weight of what I'd discovered felt enormous, not just the financial crimes, but the betrayal of trust, the violation of everything I'd believed about my employer. My relationship with Derek had deteriorated noticeably. Where he'd once been encouraging and collaborative, he now seemed suspicious of my questions and impatient with my analytical thoroughness. Our weekly one-on-one meetings had become tense affairs where he'd rush through agenda items and dismiss my concerns about financial irregularities. "Olivia, you're overthinking this," he'd say when I raised questions about vendor documentation. "Not every transaction needs to be analyzed to death. Sometimes you need to trust that the senior team knows what they're doing." But trust was exactly what I'd lost. Every interaction with Derek now felt like a performance, with both of us pretending everything was normal while knowing it wasn't. I caught him watching me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression calculating and wary. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. I couldn't discuss my discoveries with colleagues. They might be involved, or they might inadvertently tip off the wrong people. I couldn't talk to friends or family about what was consuming my thoughts every day. The burden of knowledge sat heavily on my shoulders, making me feel simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. I knew I was approaching a decision point. The evidence I'd gathered was substantial enough to warrant serious investigation, but I also knew that once I acted on it, there would be no going back. Whistleblowing on corporate fraud wasn't just a professional decision. It was a life-changing one that could affect my career, my safety, and my future in ways I couldn't predict. Late one night, as I sat surrounded by my handwritten notes and printed documents, I realized that my investigation had transformed me. I was no longer the naive young analyst who believed in corporate mission statements and ethical business practices. I'd become someone who understood that integrity sometimes required courage, that doing the right thing often meant risking everything you'd worked to build. The question was whether I had that kind of courage. The monthly board meeting where everything changed was held on a grey October morning in Meridian's executive conference room. The mahogany tables stretched nearly 20 feet, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, but the atmosphere in the room felt darker than the storm clouds gathering outside. I prepared meticulously for this presentation, knowing it might be my only opportunity to raise concerns about the financial irregularities I'd discovered. The board meeting minutes would later show that I'd followed proper protocols, documented my findings professionally, and raised legitimate questions about our financial reporting details that would become crucial when Derek tried to destroy my credibility. Derek sat at the head of the table, flanked by CEO Michael Chen and CFO Patricia Wells. The other board members, a mix of internal executives and external advisors, chatted quietly as we waited for the meeting to begin. I sat midway down the table, my presentation materials organized in a neat folder, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Let's begin with the quarterly financial review," Derek announced, nodding toward me. "Olivia will walk us through the key metrics." I stood and activated the projection system, my first slide displaying our overall financial performance for Q3. The numbers looked impressive: revenue growth of 12%, profit margins maintained at healthy levels, operating expenses within budgeted parameters. But I knew the expenses included millions in fraudulent consulting payments. Our third quarter performance shows strong fundamentals across most categories. I began, my voice steady and professional. However, I do have some concerns about specific expense categories that warrant board attention. I clicked to my next slide, which detailed the consulting expenses I'd been investigating. The room's energy shifted subtly. I could feel Derek's attention sharpen, though his expression remained neutral. We've seen significant increases in consulting fees over the past year, with payments totaling $2.7 million to firms that appeared to provide minimal documentation of their services. I paused, letting that number sink in. Strategic Solutions International, global advisory partners, and similar entities have received substantial payments for what our records describe as strategic consulting, but I've been unable to locate supporting documentation for these projects. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia Wells shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Michael Chen's pen had stopped moving across his notepad. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "These consulting arrangements," Derek interjected, his voice carefully controlled, "involve proprietary strategic initiatives that require confidential handling. The documentation you're looking for is maintained separately for competitive security reasons." "I understand the need for confidentiality," I replied, staying focused on the facts. "However, from a financial reporting perspective, we need adequate documentation to support these expenses. External auditors will require detailed substantiation, and the current invoices are quite general in their descriptions." Board member James Harrison, a former SEC attorney, leaned forward with interest. "What specific concerns do you have about the documentation, Olivia?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I took a breath and committed to the truth. The vendors in question appeared to be shell companies with minimal business presence. Their invoices lacked the detail typically required for legitimate consulting services, and several maintained banking relationships in offshore tax havens. These characteristics are consistent with arrangements designed to move money overseas while avoiding U.S. tax obligations. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Derek's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady when he responded. "That's a very serious accusation, Olivia. I think you're misunderstanding the nature of these business relationships." "I'm not making accusations," I said calmly. "I'm identifying financial reporting irregularities that require investigation. Our fiduciary duty to shareholders demands that we ensure all expenses are legitimate and properly documented." Patricia Wells spoke up, her tone sharp. "Olivia, these consulting arrangements were approved at the highest levels of the company. Your role is to analyze and report the numbers, not to question strategic business decisions made by senior management." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, but I pressed on. "My role is to ensure accurate financial reporting. When I identify potential irregularities, I have a professional obligation to bring them to the board's attention." Derek stood up, his movement sudden enough to startle several board members. "I think we need to table this discussion for now. Olivia, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a smaller setting, where we can address your concerns more appropriately." But James Harrison wasn't ready to let it go. "Actually, I'd like to hear more about these documentation concerns. If there are potential compliance issues, the board needs to understand them fully." For the next 20 minutes, I detailed my findings as professionally as possible, focusing on factual discrepancies rather than accusations of fraud. I explained the lack of supporting documentation, the offshore banking arrangements, the generic nature of the invoices, and the escalating amounts over time. Some board members asked thoughtful questions about our vendor verification processes and documentation requirements. Others seemed uncomfortable with the entire discussion, exchanging glances with Derek and Patricia that suggested they wanted the topic to disappear. Derek's responses became increasingly defensive as the questioning continued. He dismissed my concerns as analytical overthinking and suggested I was exceeding the scope of my responsibilities. The more he tried to shut down the discussion, the more suspicious his behavior appeared to the external board members. The meeting finally ended. The atmosphere was tense and awkward. Board members filed out quietly, several stopping to thank me for my thorough analysis. James Harrison lingered to ask for copies of my supporting documentation, which I promised to provide. Derek waited until the room had emptied before approaching. Emmy, his usual fake smile had been replaced by something much colder. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "My office. 10 minutes. As I gathered my materials, I realized I'd crossed a line from which there would be no return. I'd publicly challenged the company's financial practices in front of the board, documented potential fraud in official meeting minutes, and made it impossible for Derek to ignore or dismiss my concerns. The 10-minute walk to Derek's office felt like a death march. I knew my career at Meridian Holdings was about to change dramatically, but I also knew I'd done the right thing. Professional integrity sometimes required personal sacrifice, and I was about to learn exactly what that sacrifice would cost me. The performance review document that would later be used to justify my demotion was a masterpiece of corporate manipulation. Crafted over the 3 weeks following my board presentation, Derek didn't waste time with subtlety. He launched a systematic campaign to destroy my credibility and create a paper trail that would support whatever action he planned to take against me. The retaliation began immediately. After our tense meeting, in his office, where he'd made it clear that my overreach in the board meeting was unacceptable. Within days, I noticed the first signs of my professional isolation. Emails about important meetings somehow failed to reach my inbox. Project assignments I'd been leading were quietly reassigned to other analysts. Colleagues who'd previously sought my input on financial analyzers suddenly stopped consulting me. Sarah from marketing, who used to stop by my office several times a week for budget advice, started avoiding eye contact in the hallway. When I finally cornered her at the coffee machine, she seemed nervous and distracted. "Hey Sarah, did you get my email about the Q4 marketing budget analysis?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, that," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Derek told me he'd handle the marketing budgets directly this quarter. He said you're focusing on other priorities." Other priorities. That was news to me, since Derek hadn't assigned me any new projects since the board meeting. My days had become strangely empty, filled with busy work and tasks that seemed designed to keep me occupied rather than productive. Tom from operations had a similar response. When I tried to discuss his efficiency initiative, Derek said the executive team would handle operational analyzers internally. "Thanks though, Olivia." The dismissal was polite but final. Another door closing on my influence within the company. The exclusion from decision-making processes was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of Derek's campaign. For 2 years, I'd been included in strategic planning sessions, budget meetings, and high-level financial discussions. Now I learned about important decisions through company-wide emails, or overheard conversations in the break room. A major acquisition opportunity arose, exactly the kind of financial analysis I'd previously been called upon to lead. Instead, Derek hired an external consulting firm to conduct the due diligence, despite having a perfectly capable analytics team in-house. The message was clear. My analytical skills were no longer valued or trusted. HR's sudden interest in my communication style was the most insidious part of the retaliation. Linda Martinez from Human Resources, a different Martinez. Then my college professor scheduled a meeting to discuss feedback from colleagues about interpersonal dynamics. "We've received some concerns about your approach in meetings," Linda explained, her tone professionally sympathetic. "Some colleagues feel you can be confrontational when discussing financial matters." Confrontational. The word stung because it was so clearly designed to undermine my credibility, while appearing to address legitimate workplace concerns. Asking questions about fraudulent expenses wasn't confrontational, it was professional due diligence. "Can you be more specific about these concerns?" I asked. I'd like to understand what behaviors I should modify. Linda consulted her notes that I suspected had been carefully prepared in coordination with Derek. There's been feedback that you sometimes challenge senior management decisions in public forums, and that you pursue issues beyond the scope of your responsibilities. The board meeting. They were creating an official record that painted my ethical concerns as insubordination and my professional obligations as overreach. The performance review document that would emerge from these manufactured complaints would justify whatever disciplinary action Derek chose to take. Meanwhile, my access to financial systems began to change in subtle ways. Database queries that previously ran without issues suddenly required additional approval. Reports I'd been generating monthly were moved to a need-to-know basis. My system privileges were quietly downgraded, limiting my ability to access the very information I needed to do my job effectively. The psychological warfare was exhausting. I'd wake up each morning wondering what new humiliation awaited me at the office. Would another project be reassigned? Would another colleague suddenly become too busy to work with me? Would I discover another system access had been revoked? Derek's strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. He wasn't doing anything overtly illegal or obviously retaliatory. On paper, he was addressing performance concerns and managing team dynamics. In reality, he was systematically destroying my professional standing and creating justification for more severe action. The manufactured performance review painted a picture of an analyst who exceeded her authority, challenged appropriate management decisions, and created workplace tension through inappropriate questioning of business practices. None of it was true, but all of it was carefully documented and seemingly supported by colleague feedback and management observations. My few remaining allies in the company began distancing themselves, whether out of fear for their own jobs or genuine belief in the narrative Derek was constructing. The isolation was complete. I was surrounded by co-workers, but professionally alone. Like a leper in a community that had once embraced me. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Derek requested another meeting with HR present. As I walked to the conference room, I knew this was the end of my time as lead financial analyst. The performance review document in Linda's folder would be my professional death warrant, crafted with corporate precision to justify the predetermined outcome. The setup was complete. Now came the execution. The new employment contract sitting on Derek's desk represented the complete destruction of everything I'd built over 2 years at Meridian Holdings. The document, with its revised salary figures and diminished responsibilities, was the final insult in a carefully orchestrated campaign to silence my concerns about corporate fraud. Derek's office felt different that morning, colder, more formal. Despite the same mahogany furniture and panoramic city views, Linda Martinez from HR sat in one of the leather chairs across from Derek's desk, a manila folder thick with documentation positioned strategically in front of her. I took the remaining chair, my back straight, determined to maintain my dignity, regardless of what was about to happen. "Olivia, thank you for coming," Derek began, his tone professionally sympathetic in a way that immediately set me on edge. "Linda and I need to discuss some organizational changes that affect your position." Organizational changes. The euphemism was almost laughable, given that my position had been systematically undermined for 3 weeks. I nodded silently, waiting for the inevitable. Linda opened her folder and withdrew the fabricated performance review I'd been expecting. "We've been conducting a comprehensive evaluation of team dynamics and individual performance metrics," she said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of HR professionals delivering bad news. "There are some concerns we need to address." The review was a masterpiece of corporate character assassination. According to the document, I had consistently exceeded the scope of analytical responsibilities, demonstrated inappropriate questioning of strategic business decisions, and created workplace tension through confrontational communication styles. Each criticism was carefully worded to sound professional while painting me as insubordinate and difficult. "These concerns," Derek added, have been raised by multiple colleagues and observed directly by senior management. We've decided that a restructuring of your role would benefit both you and the team. Restructuring. Another euphemism for demotion, designed to make corporate retaliation sound like career development. I scanned the performance review, noting how my professional diligence had been reframed as problematic behavior. Asking questions about fraudulent expenses became exceeding analytical scope. Raising concerns about tax evasion became inappropriate questioning of management. What exactly does this restructuring involve? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Derek slid the new employment contract across his desk. We're moving you to a junior analyst position, where you can focus on core analytical tasks without the pressure of strategic decision-making. The role comes with adjusted compensation that reflects the reduced responsibilities. Adjusted compensation. I scanned the contract quickly, my heart sinking as I absorbed the numbers. My salary was being cut from $140,000 to $56,000, a 60% reduction that would make my current lifestyle impossible. The corner office, company car allowance, and health insurance premium coverage were all eliminated. I was being financially devastated. For doing my job correctly. This is retaliation for raising concerns about financial irregularities, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Linda immediately responded with practiced corporate defensiveness. This restructuring is based on performance evaluations and business needs, not on any protected activity. The company has every right to adjust roles and compensation based on organizational requirements. Protected activity. The phrase revealed that they'd consulted with legal counsel, carefully structuring my demotion to avoid obvious whistleblower retaliation claims. They created a paper trail that made my concerns appear to be performance issues rather than ethical obligations. Derek leaned back in his chair, that fake sympathetic expression never wavering. Olivia, this is actually an opportunity for you to refocus on areas where you excel. Sometimes we all need to step back and reassess our professional priorities. The condescension was breathtaking. This man who'd once called me his secret weapon, who'd praised my analytical insights and recommended me for promotions, was now suggesting that being demoted was somehow beneficial for my career development. I assume I need to sign this today? I asked, gesturing toward the contract. We'd prefer to finalize the transition quickly, Derek replied. For continuity purposes. Translation: they wanted to complete my professional destruction before I could seek legal advice or find alternative employment. The timeline was clearly designed to pressure me into accepting terms that would make it difficult to challenge their actions later. I took the contract and read through it carefully, noting clauses that seemed designed to limit my future options. There were non-disparagement provisions that would prevent me from discussing my concerns about the company. There were confidentiality agreements that could be interpreted to prohibit whistleblowing. The document was as much about silencing me as it was about reducing my salary. I need time to review this thoroughly, I said, folding the contract and preparing to leave. Of course, Derek replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. That we'll need your decision by end of business tomorrow. The new organizational structure takes effect next week. Another pressure tactic, designed to prevent me from consulting with attorneys or understanding my rights. They wanted my signature while I was still reeling from the shock of the demotion. As I stood to leave, Derek made one final attempt at manipulation. Olivia, I hope you understand that this decision was difficult for all of us. We value your contributions to the company, and we believe this new role will be a better fit for your skills and career goals. The gaslighting was almost impressive in its audacity. They were destroying my career while pretending to help it, retaliating against my ethical concerns while claiming to address performance issues. The entire conversation was theater designed to create legal cover for corporate revenge. I walked out of Derek's office with my head high, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. But as I gathered my personal belongings from my corner office and prepared to move to a cubicle on the third floor, The reality of my situation began to sink in. They thought the demotion would silence me. They thought financial pressure would force me to accept their version of events and abandon my concerns about tax evasion. They thought I would choose financial security over professional integrity. They had seriously underestimated me. The personal budget spreadsheet I created that evening was a stark reminder of how dramatically my life was about to change. Sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a glass of wine that I probably couldn't afford anymore, I methodically calculated the financial impact of Derek's retaliation. My monthly take-home pay would drop from $8,200 to $3,280, a devastating reduction that would affect every aspect of my carefully constructed adult life. The numbers on my screen told a story of forced downward mobility, of dreams deferred and security shattered. My Lincoln Park apartment, with its exposed brick walls and lake views, cost $3,200 per month including utilities. Under my new salary, that single expense would consume 98% of my take-home pay, leaving virtually nothing for food, transportation, insurance, or student loan payments. The life I built was mathematically impossible to maintain. I opened a new tab and began searching for cheaper apartments, my heart sinking as I scrolled through listings for studio apartments in less desirable neighborhoods. The best I could afford was a $1,400 efficiency in Logan Square, a 45-minute commute from downtown, and roughly half the size of my current place. No dishwasher, no in-unit laundry, no view of anything but the brick wall of the adjacent building. The car lease on my BMW would have to go. The $485 monthly payment was now an unaffordable luxury, forcing me back to public transportation and the occasional rideshare. I calculated the early termination fee $2,800 that I didn't have and added it to my growing list of financial casualties. My student loan payments alone would consume $680 per month for the next 8 years. The Northwestern MBA that had seemed like such a smart investment 2 years ago now felt like a millstone around my neck. I could apply for income-based repayment, but that would only delay the inevitable and add thousands in interest charges. Health insurance situation was perhaps the most frightening. Under my new position, I'd be responsible for the full premium, cost $847 per month for coverage equivalent to what I'd had as a senior analyst. I could choose a high-deductible plan for less money. That would mean risking financial catastrophe. If I needed medical care, I created scenarios in my spreadsheet, modeling different combinations of lifestyle changes. Cancel gym membership, save $89. Cook all meals at home, save approximately $300. Eliminate entertainment budget, save $200. Buy generic groceries exclusively, save another $150. Even with extreme frugality, I'd be living paycheck to paycheck. With no emergency fund, the psychological impact of these calculations was almost worse than the financial reality. I'd worked so hard to escape the financial insecurity of my college years, when every expense required careful consideration and unexpected costs could derail my entire month. Now I was being forced back into that mindset, not because of poor financial decisions but because of corporate retaliation. I pulled up my savings account balance, $34,000 that I'd accumulated through careful budgeting and ambitious saving goals. It would cover the apartment lease termination, security deposit for a new place, moving expenses, and perhaps 3 months of survival at my reduced income level. After that, I need to find a new job or accept Derek's terms permanently. Vacation to Italy I'd planned for Christmas was obviously cancelled. The $4,200 I'd already spent on flights and hotel reservations was gone travel. Insurance wouldn't cover cancellation due to voluntary job changes, and I couldn't afford to explain that my position had been eliminated through retaliation. My retirement contributions would have to stop entirely. The $500 monthly investment in my 401k was no longer possible, meaning I'd lose not only the tax benefits, but also the company matching funds that had been accelerating my long-term financial goals. Derek's retaliation wasn't just affecting my current lifestyle, it was destroying my future financial security. The wine glass was empty, but I couldn't justify opening another bottle. Alcohol was now a luxury item to be rationed carefully. I made a note in my spreadsheet: eliminate alcohol purchases except for special occasions. Every expense would need justification under my new financial reality. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together, overwhelmed by the comprehensive destruction of my financial stability. Derek had crafted the perfect punishment: severe enough to force compliance, but not quite devastating enough to trigger obvious legal protections. I could survive at this income level, barely, but I couldn't thrive or build the career I'd envisioned. The cruelest part was knowing that this financial pressure was exactly what Derek intended. He was counting on my need for security, my fear of financial instability, my practical concerns about rent and student loans. He expected me to choose survival over integrity, to accept the demotion quietly rather than risk unemployment by continuing to raise concerns about corporate fraud. But as I closed my laptop and prepared for bed in the apartment I'd soon have to leave, I realized that Derek had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that financial pressure would make me compliant and grateful. Instead, it was making me angry. The $12 million in tax evasion I'd uncovered suddenly felt personal. While I was being forced into financial hardship for doing my job correctly, Derek and his co-conspirators were stealing millions from taxpayers. The injustice was so profound that it crystallized my resolve. I wouldn't be intimidated into silence. I wouldn't accept that ethical behavior should be punished while fraud was rewarded. And I definitely wouldn't let Derek destroy my career to protect his criminal enterprise. The question was no longer whether I could afford to fight back. The question was whether I could afford not to. The USB drive hidden in my jewelry box contained enough evidence to destroy Meridian Holdings and send several executives to federal prison. Over the course of 2 weeks, working late into the night after my humiliating days in the third-floor cubicle, I methodically copied every document, email, and financial record related to the tax evasion scheme. My reduced system privileges actually worked in my favor. Derek and his co-conspirators had grown careless, assuming that my demotion had neutralized me as a threat. They'd left my database access partially intact, probably to maintain the fiction that I was still performing legitimate analytical work. What they didn't realize was that my forensic accounting training had taught me exactly what evidence would. You needed to prove financial crimes. I started with the shell companies, downloading incorporation documents, banking records, and invoice histories for Strategic Solutions International, Global Advisory Partners, and the dozen other entities I'd identified. The pattern was even more extensive than I'd initially realized. Meridian had been systematically funneling money offshore for nearly 4 years, with the amounts increasing dramatically over time. The emails were the most damaging evidence. Derek had been surprisingly careless about electronic communication, sending messages that explicitly discussed minimizing tax exposure and optimizing offshore arrangements. One email chain between Derek and Patricia Wells included detailed instructions for creating invoices that would satisfy audit requirements while maintaining operational flexibility. Corporate code for tax fraud, spelled out in black and white in their own words. I accessed the company's legal database and downloaded every document related to international tax compliance, corporate structure, and offshore banking relationships. The legitimate legal advice contrasted sharply with the actual practices, showing a clear pattern of ignoring professional counsel in favor of criminal shortcuts. The most challenging part was documenting the money flows without triggering system alerts. I developed a routine of running complex financial queries during busy periods when my database activity would be lost in the normal business operations. I'd export large datasets for analytical projects, then sort through them at home to extract the fraudulent transactions. My apartment had transformed into a command center for corporate investigation. I'd purchased a high-capacity external drive to store copies of everything, organized files by date and transaction type, and created detailed cross-references that would allow investigators to quickly understand the scope of the scheme. The financial analysis was staggering. Over 4 years, Meridian Holdings had evaded approximately $4.3 million in federal corporate income taxes through fraudulent consulting payments. Including state taxes, penalties, and interest, the total liability exceeded $12 million. The individual executives involved faced potential criminal charges, carrying prison sentences of 5 to 10 years. I researched whistleblower protection laws extensively, learning about the legal framework that was supposed to protect employees who reported corporate crimes. The IRS whistleblower program offered financial rewards for information, leading to successful prosecution of tax crimes, typically 15 to 30% of recovered amounts. If my case was successful, I could receive $1.80 to $3.6 million in compensation. The irony was perfect. Derek's retaliation had cost me approximately $80,000 in annual income, but his criminal activities could ultimately make me wealthy enough to never worry about corporate politics again. Justice and revenge were converging in ways that felt almost poetic. The financial reward wasn't my primary motivation. I was driven by a combination of professional integrity and personal anger that made backing down impossible. Every day I spent in that cramped cubicle, every condescending interaction with former colleagues, every financial stress caused by my reduced salary only reinforced my determination to see Derek and his conspirators held accountable. The risk assessment was sobering. Whistleblowing on corporate fraud could end my career in corporate finance, regardless of legal protections. Derek would certainly attempt to destroy my professional reputation, and potential employers might view me as a troublemaker regardless of the merits of my case. I could win the legal battle and still lose the career war. I also had to consider personal safety. Corporate executives facing potential prison time have been known to engage in intimidation, harassment, and worse. I researched security measures, changed my locks, and began varying my daily routines to make myself a more difficult target. The evidence collection was nearly complete when I discovered the most damaging documents of all: internal memos discussing my investigation and demotion. Derek had been surprisingly explicit in his communications with Patricia and Michael, describing me as a compliance risk who needed to be neutralized through appropriate human resources measures. One email from Patricia to Derek was particularly damning. The Williams situation requires careful handling. We can't afford to have her raising these issues with external parties. The restructuring should provide sufficient financial pressure to ensure cooperation. They documented their retaliation in writing, creating perfect evidence of corporate revenge against a whistleblower. The memo would make it impossible for them to claim that my demotion was based on legitimate performance concerns. Late one night, as I uploaded the final batch of files to my encrypted storage system, I realized that I'd assembled one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud cases in recent history. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulously documented, and legally devastating. Derek and his co-conspirators had handed me everything I needed to destroy them. The USB drive contained their confessions, financial records, email communications, and legal violations spanning 4 years of criminal activity. It was a roadmap to justice that would eventually lead federal agents directly to Meridian Holdings executive offices, but possessing evidence and acting on it were different challenges entirely. The next phase would require courage, legal expertise, and faith in a justice system that didn't always protect people who tried to do the right thing. I sealed the USB drive in a fireproof safe and began researching whistleblower attorneys. The time for investigation was over. The time for action had begun. The organizational chart I'd hand-drawn on poster board and tacked to my apartment wall looked like something from a crime drama, a complex web of connections linking corporate executives, shell companies, and offshore accounts in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Meridian Holdings. Red string connected the major players, while yellow highlighted money flows and blue traced communication patterns. At the center of the web sat Derek Martinez, that my investigation had revealed that he wasn't the mastermind. That distinction belonged to CEO Michael Chen, who had apparently been orchestrating the tax evasion scheme since joining the company 4 years ago. Patricia Wells, the CFO, served as the operational coordinator, managing the technical aspects of money movement and documentation. The scope was breathtaking. What I'd initially thought was Derek's independent fraud was actually a systematic corporate conspiracy involving at least 6 senior executives, 2 board members, and a network of professional facilitators including attorneys, accountants, and banking representatives in 3 countries. Michael Chen's background made the pieces fall into place. Before joining Meridian, he'd worked for a consulting firm specializing in international tax optimization, corporate code for legal and semi-legal strategies to minimize tax obligations. His expertise in offshore structures and shell company arrangements had been the foundation for Meridian's criminal enterprise. The board members' involvement was particularly shocking. James Harrison, the former SEC attorney who'd asked thoughtful questions during my presentation, was apparently being kept in the dark about the scheme. But board members Sarah Kim and Robert Martinez, Derek's cousin, I learned were active participants who helped approve the fraudulent consulting payments. Patricia Wells had been the technical architect using her CPA credentials and forensic accounting background to create documentation that would satisfy superficial auditor review while hiding the criminal nature of the transactions. Her emails revealed sophisticated understanding of audit procedures and regulatory blind spots. The shell company network was far more complex than I'd initially realized. Strategic Solutions International was just one node in a web of interconnected entities designed to obscure money flows and create plausible deniability. The companies were incorporated in Delaware, maintained operational addresses in Nevada, held banking relationships in the Cayman Islands, and conducted business activities in Ireland for additional tax benefits. Each shell company served a specific function in the money laundering operation. Strategic Solutions International handled the largest transactions, typically $500,000 to $1 million per quarter. Global Advisory Partners managed medium-sized payments in the $200,000 to $500,000 range. Smaller entities like Worldwide Consulting Group and International Business Solutions processed payments below $200,000 to stay under various reporting thresholds. The money flows revealed a sophisticated understanding of international banking regulations. Payments from Meridian's U.S. accounts went to shell companies' Delaware bank accounts, then were immediately transferred to Cayman Islands accounts controlled by the same entities. From there, funds moved through a series of intermediate accounts in Switzerland and Luxembourg before arriving at personal accounts controlled by the Meridian executives. My financial analysis revealed that over 4 years, the conspirators had stolen approximately $8.7 million in corporate funds, while evading $4.3 million in tax obligations. The personal accounts in Switzerland contained $6.2 million. That should have been taxed as corporate income and individual compensation. The personal betrayal was perhaps the most painful discovery. People I'd respected and admired, executives who spoke eloquently about corporate ethics and social responsibility, were criminals who'd built their wealth through systematic fraud. Their public personas were elaborate lies designed to hide their true nature. Michael Chen, who'd given inspiring speeches about corporate citizenship and community responsibility, had been stealing taxpayer money while Meridian received tax incentives for job creation and economic development. The hypocrisy was staggering. He was simultaneously taking public benefits and avoiding public obligations. Patricia Wells, who'd mentored young female accountants and spoken at professional conferences about ethical financial practices, had prostituted her CPA credentials to facilitate tax evasion. Her professional reputation was built on expertise she used to commit the very crime she publicly condemned. Derek's betrayal felt the most personal. He'd been my direct supervisor, the person who'd guided my career development and praised my analytical skills. Every positive interaction, every piece of career advice, every expression of confidence in my abilities had been tainted by his criminal activities and willingness to destroy my career to protect them. The timeline revealed how my investigation had triggered increasingly desperate responses from the conspirators. Internal emails showed growing paranoia about regulatory scrutiny, with Michael Chun pushing for acceleration of fund transfers and Patricia Wells advocating for elimination of compliance risks, meaning me. One email chain from the week before my demotion was particularly chilling. Derek had written, "The Williams situation is becoming untenable. She's asking too many specific questions and has the technical skills to understand what she's seeing. We need permanent solutions." Patricia's response was equally disturbing. "Agreed. Financial pressure should resolve the immediate issue, but we may need additional measures if she doesn't respond appropriately to the restructuring." Additional measures. The phrase suggested they'd considered options beyond simple retaliation. Though the emails stopped short of explicit threats, the implication was clear enough to make me grateful for the security precautions I'd implemented. The most damaging evidence was a summary document that Patricia had created for tax planning purposes, explicitly quantifying the scheme's financial benefits. The spreadsheet showed projected tax savings of $2.1 million annually through continued use of shell company arrangements, along with risk assessments for various regulatory scenarios. The document included contingency plans for dealing with IRS audits, SEC investigations, and whistleblower complaints. They'd actually planned for the possibility that someone like me would discover their crimes and take action. Their arrogance was matched only by their stupidity in documenting their criminal intentions so explicitly. As I studied the organizational chart and supporting evidence, I realized that I'd uncovered one of the most significant corporate fraud cases in recent history. The conspiracy involved millions of dollars, multiple federal crimes, and a level of premeditation that would make prosecution relatively straightforward. But I also understood that these people had resources, connections, and motivations that made them extremely dangerous opponents. They'd already demonstrated willingness to retaliate against threats to their operation. Exposing them would require more than evidence. It would require courage, legal protection, and probably a significant amount of luck. The business card for Maria Santos ESQ felt like a lifeline in my trembling hands as I sat in the marble lobby of her downtown law firm. Whistleblower protection and corporate fraud was printed in elegant script below her name, suggesting exactly the kind of expertise I desperately needed. The firm's reputation for taking on powerful corporations had made them my first choice after extensive research into Chicago's whistleblower attorneys. Maria's office reflected both success and substance. Law books lined the walls, framed newspaper articles documented major case victories, and her Northwestern law degree hung prominently behind her desk. She was younger than I had expected, probably early 40s, with an intensity that suggested she took corporate fraud cases personally. "Ms. Williams," she said after reviewing the summary I'd prepared, "this is one of the most comprehensive fraud documentations I've seen in 15 years of practice. You've essentially done the government's investigative work for them." I brought copies of the most damaging evidence emails discussing the scheme, financial records showing money flows, and documentation of my retaliation. Maria spread the papers across her conference table, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions about technical details. "The IRS whistleblower program is designed for exactly this type of case," she explained. "Tax evasion of this magnitude, with this level of documentation, typically results in substantial rewards for informants who provide actionable information." The financial details were encouraging. Under federal law, whistleblowers could receive 15 to 30% of recovered taxes, penalties, and interest, with Meridian's total liability estimated at $12 to $15 million. My potential reward could range from $1.80 to $4.5 million. The exact percentage would depend on the quality of my information, and the cooperation I provided during investigation. However, Maria continued, her tone becoming more serious, whistleblowing on corporate fraud is not without risks. These cases can take 3 to 7 years to resolve, during which time you'll face ongoing retaliation, legal challenges, and personal stress. Your employers will hire the best attorneys money can buy to discredit you and minimize their liability. The protection framework was complex but encouraging. Federal whistleblower laws prohibited retaliation against employees who reported corporate crimes, with penalties including job reinstatement, back pay, and punitive damages. My demotion and salary reduction were textbook examples of illegal retaliation that could result in substantial compensation beyond the basic whistleblower reward. Your retaliation evidence is particularly strong, Maria noted, reviewing Derek's emails about neutralizing compliance risks. They documented their retaliatory intent in writing, which makes proving illegal retaliation relatively straightforward. Most corporate executives are smart enough to avoid creating paper trails for their revenge. The timeline for action was critical. IRS whistleblower complaints had statute of limitations considerations, and delayed reporting could affect both the strength of the case and the size of potential rewards. Maria recommended filing within 30 days to maximize protection and preserve all legal options. The investigation process typically begins with IRS Criminal Investigation Division reviewing your evidence, she explained. If they determine the case has merit, they'll open a formal investigation that could include search warrants, interviews, and financial audits. Your role would be as a cooperating witness providing expertise about the company's operations. The personal risks were sobering but manageable. Corporate executives facing potential prison time, sometimes engaged in intimidation or harassment, but federal authorities took threats against whistleblowers seriously. Maria's firm had relationships with law enforcement agencies that could provide protection if circumstances warranted. I won't lie to you, Maria said, leaning back in her chair. Whistleblowing will change your life permanently. Some clients find the stress overwhelming, others discover a sense of purpose they never knew they had. But almost all of them say they're glad they had the courage to come forward. The fee structure was favorable. Maria would work on contingency, taking 25% of any financial recovery, while advancing all costs associated with the case. If the whistleblower complaint was unsuccessful, I wouldn't owe attorneys fees, though I'd be responsible for direct expenses like copying and filing costs. Your case has several advantages, Maria continued. First, the evidence is overwhelming and well documented. Second, the financial amounts are substantial enough to warrant serious federal attention. Third, your professional credentials and clean background make you a credible witness. Fourth, their retaliation against you actually strengthens the case by providing additional damages. We discussed strategy for the next phase. Maria would prepare the formal IRS whistleblower complaint using Form 211, organize my evidence into a format suitable for federal investigators, and coordinate with IRS Criminal Investigation Division to ensure my information received appropriate attention. The key is presenting this as a complete package, she explained. We want federal investigators to see immediately that this is a serious case worth pursuing, not just another disgruntled employee complaint. The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering legal strategy, timeline expectations, financial projections, and risk mitigation. By the end, I felt confident that I'd chosen the right attorney and approach for pursuing justice against Meridian Holdings. As I prepared to leave, Maria handed me her business card and made one final observation. Olivia, in 15 years of representing whistleblowers, I've learned that the people who succeed in these cases share certain characteristics. They're driven by principle rather than revenge. They understand that justice takes time, and they refuse to be intimidated by powerful opponents. You have all of those qualities. Walking out of her office building into the crisp October air, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The legal framework existed to protect me and reward my courage. The evidence was overwhelming and the attorney was experienced. The financial compensation could change my life permanently, but I also understood that I was about to declare war on people with resources, connections, and motivations that made them extremely dangerous enemies. The next phase would test not just the strength of my case, but the depth of my resolve. IRS Form 211 sat on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon, its innocuous appearance belying the devastating power it would unleash once submitted. Maria had prepared the 47-page whistleblower complaint with surgical precision, transforming my months of investigation into a legal document that would trigger a federal investigation, capable of destroying Meridian Holdings and sending multiple executives to prison. It was 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, and I'd been staring at the signature page for over an hour. My pen hovered above the line where my name would officially transform me from corporate analyst to federal informant. Once I signed and Maria filed the complaint, there would be no return to my former life, no possibility of reconciliation with Derek, no chance of rebuilding my career at Meridian, no option to pretend I'd never discovered the fraud. The apartment around me bore testament to how dramatically my life had already changed. Boxes lined the walls, packed with belongings that would move to my smaller place in Logan Square next week. The BMW keys sat unused on the counter. I'd returned the car yesterday and taken the blue line home. My designer work clothes hung in the closet, most of them too expensive for my new budget and too formal for whatever career would emerge from the ashes of this confrontation. But the financial pressures that Derek thought would force my compliance had instead crystallized my resolve. Every day I spent in that humiliating cubicle, every condescending interaction with former colleagues, every reminder of my diminished status, only reinforced the injustice of being punished for ethical behavior while criminals prospered. The evidence Maria had organized was overwhelming. 47 pages of financial records, email communications, and analytical summaries that documented $4.3 million in tax evasion and $8.7 million in corporate theft. The shell company network, the offshore accounts, the falsified invoices, the retaliation against me, everything was documented with the kind of precision that made prosecution almost inevitable. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through text. Messages from friends who'd noticed my recent withdrawal from social activities. Sarah from college had invited me to dinner 3 times in the past month, her concern obvious in increasingly direct questions about whether everything was okay. My parents had called twice last week, picking up on something in my voice that suggested I was under unusual stress. None of them could know what I was dealing with. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire experience, carrying the weight of knowledge that could destroy people's lives, while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in everyday interactions. I'd become skilled at deflecting personal questions and manufacturing explanations for my obvious distraction. The moral calculation was surprisingly clear. Derek and his conspirators had stolen millions of dollars from taxpayers while destroying my career for attempting to stop them. They documented their crimes in writing, explicitly discussed retaliating against me, and demonstrated complete contempt for legal and ethical obligations. They deserved whatever consequences federal prosecution would bring, but I also thought about the innocent employees who would suffer when Meridian Holdings faced federal investigation. The administrative assistants, junior analysts, and support staff who had nothing to do with the fraud, but would lose their jobs when the company collapsed under criminal liability. The shareholders who'd invested based on fraudulent financial statements. The customers who relied on Meridian services. Maria had addressed these concerns during our consultation. Corporate fraud always has collateral damage, she'd said. But the responsibility lies with the criminals who created the situation, not with the whistleblower who exposes it. Your silence won't protect innocent people. It will only enable continued crimes that will eventually cause even greater harm. I thought about the larger implications of staying silent. If corporate executives could evade taxes and retaliate against ethical employees without consequences, what message did that send about the rule of law? How many other companies were engaged in similar schemes, counting on employee fear and financial pressure to maintain their criminal enterprises? The pen felt heavy in my hand as I finally signed my name to the complaint. The signature was less dramatic than I had expected, just my usual scrawl across a legal document. But I understood that I'd just initiated a process that would fundamentally alter multiple lives, including my own. I photographed the signed pages and emailed them to Maria, then placed the original documents in the fireproof safe, where I kept copies of all my evidence. The submission was irreversible now. Maria would file the complaint with ISA, Criminal Investigation Division, first thing Monday morning, triggering a federal investigation that would quickly expand beyond anyone's control. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. For the first time in months, I felt the peace that comes from moral clarity and decisive action. I'd done everything possible to resolve the situation through internal channels. I documented the crimes meticulously and consulted with expert legal counsel. I'd considered the consequences for all parties involved and chosen justice over self-preservation. Derek had calculated that financial pressure would force my compliance and silence. He'd assumed that career concerns would outweigh ethical obligations. He'd believed that corporate power could intimidate individual conscience into submission. Tomorrow morning, he would begin learning how wrong he'd been. The federal government would receive detailed evidence of his crimes, supported by his own email communications and financial records. The investigation that followed would be thorough, professional, and utterly devastating to everyone involved in the conspiracy. I woke up Monday morning feeling lighter than I had in months. The terrible weight of carrying secrets had been lifted, replaced by the anticipation of justice finally being served. Derek thought he'd destroyed my career to protect his criminal enterprise. Instead, he'd created the perfect conditions for his own destruction. The IRS badge that Special Agent Jennifer Walsh flashed at Meridian's reception desk on a cold November morning represented the moment Derek's world began to collapse. From my cramped third-floor cubicle, I watched through the glass partition as 3 federal agents in dark suits rode the elevator to the executive floors, carrying briefcases that undoubtedly contained search warrants and seizure orders. Maria had warned me that the investigation would begin quickly once the IRS Criminal Investigation Division reviewed my evidence. "Your documentation is so comprehensive that they won't need months of preliminary investigation," she'd explained. "They'll move directly to the evidence-gathering phase." The timing was perfect. My whistleblower complaint had been filed on a Monday. By Friday, federal agents were conducting surprise interviews and document seizures. The speed suggested that my evidence had triggered immediate concern at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Maintained my cover as a regular employee, arriving at work at my usual time and settling into my cubicle to perform the mundane analytical tasks that comprised my diminished role. But every fiber of my being was focused on the drama unfolding 20 floors above me, where Derek was presumably experiencing the worst morning of his professional life. The office rumor mill went into overdrive within hours. Word spread quickly that federal agents were conducting interviews with senior executives and seizing computers from the finance department. Employees gathered in small groups, speculating about the investigation's focus and wondering whether their own jobs were at risk. "I heard they're looking at tax issues," whispered Jennifer from accounting, her voice carrying the mixture of excitement and fear that accompanied unexpected drama in corporate environments. "Someone said they seized Derek's computer and all the financial records for the past 5 years." The satisfaction I felt was profound but carefully concealed. Derek had spent weeks systematically destroying my professional reputation and financial security. Now federal agents were doing to him what he'd done to me, dismantling his carefully constructed world with methodical precision. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Investigation has begun. Maintain normal routine and avoid any actions that might compromise your safety or the case. I'll keep you informed of developments. The instructions were necessary because my first instinct was to position myself where I could observe Derek's reaction to the federal attention. Professional curiosity and personal vindication both urged me to witness his humiliation firsthand, but Maria was right. Maintaining cover was essential for both my safety and the investigation's integrity. The executive floor was in chaos by lunchtime. Derek's assistant, normally composed and professional, looked pale and shaken when she came down to retrieve files from the archive room. Patricia Wells' office door remained closed all day, with do not disturb signs that suggested either intense legal consultations or complete panic. Michael Chun's reaction was the most telling. The CEO, who normally projected confidence and control, appeared flustered and defensive when he briefly emerged from his office to speak with the receptionist. His usual commanding presence had been replaced by the hunted look of someone who understood that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The federal agents worked efficiently and professionally, interviewing employees, copying computer hard drives, and seizing boxes of financial documents. Their systematic approach suggested extensive preparation. They knew exactly what evidence they were seeking and where to find it. Employee morale plummeted as word of the investigation spread throughout the company. People began updating their resumes and reaching out to professional contacts, anticipating that Meridian Holdings might not survive whatever scandal was unfolding. The stock price dropped 15% by market close, with trading volumes suggesting institutional investors were abandoning their positions. Late in the afternoon, Derek finally emerged from his office accompanied by 2 federal agents and what appeared to be his attorney. His normally perfect appearance was disheveled tie, loosened, hair mussed, expression grim. The man who'd systematically destroyed my career to protect his criminal enterprise was being escorted through his own office like a suspected criminal. Our eyes met briefly as he passed my cubicle area. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped, revealing raw fury and something that might have been recognition. He knew, somehow, despite my careful maintenance of cover, Derek understood that I was responsible for the federal attention that was destroying his life. The look he gave me was pure hatred, promising retaliation that would make my demotion seem gentle by comparison. But it was also the look of a desperate man who understood that his power to hurt me was rapidly evaporating under federal scrutiny. I maintained eye contact until he looked away, letting him see the satisfaction in my expression. Every humiliation he'd inflicted on me, every condescending comment, every attempt to intimidate me into silence had led to this moment. The federal investigation was my revenge, served with the cold precision of meticulously documented evidence. The office emptied early that day, with employees eager to escape the tension and uncertainty that had pervaded the building. I worked until my normal departure time, maintaining the appearance of routine, while internally celebrating the most satisfying day of my professional life. As I rode the blue line home to my smaller apartment, I reflected on how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. 3 weeks ago, Derek had wielded absolute authority over my career and financial security. He'd been confident that corporate power could crush individual conscience, that financial pressure could purchase ethical silence. Now federal agents were seizing his computers and questioning his associates about tax evasion and criminal conspiracy. The investigation I triggered was operating with the full authority of the United States government, armed with evidence that Derek himself had provided through his careless email communications. The phone rang as I entered my apartment. Maria's voice carried obvious satisfaction. The IRS has confirmed that your evidence triggered today's action. Agent Walsh wants to schedule a formal interview with you next week to discuss your role as a cooperating witness. Cooperating witness. The phrase meant that my transition from victim to participant in Derek's destruction was now official. The federal government would rely on my expertise and testimony to prosecute the case, while I would rely on their protection and authority to ensure justice was served. Derek had taught me an important lesson about corporate power. It was formidable when used against isolated individuals, but fragile when confronted by superior authority backed by overwhelming evidence. Tomorrow would bring new developments in what promised to be a comprehensive federal investigation. But tonight, I celebrated the knowledge that Derek's criminal enterprise was finally facing the scrutiny it deserved. The newspaper headline that greeted me over coffee the next morning was everything I'd hoped for. Local tech company under federal investigation for tax evasion. The Chicago Tribune's business section featured a front-page story about Meridian Holdings' legal troubles, complete with photos of federal agents leaving the building with boxes of evidence. The article was professionally written but devastating in its implications. Reporter Sarah Chen had clearly done her homework, describing the investigation as focusing on alleged tax evasion through fraudulent consulting payments to offshore entities. While the piece avoided specific accusations pending formal charges, the details were damning enough to destroy Meridian's reputation, regardless of legal outcomes. I read every word twice, savoring the public vindication of my decision to report the fraud. The newspaper's financial analysis estimated potential tax liabilities in excess of $10 million, while legal experts quoted in the article suggested that corporate executives could face significant prison time if convicted of willful tax evasion. My phone buzzed constantly with text messages from former colleagues who'd seen the news. Most expressed shock and concern about job security, but a few seemed to understand the broader implications. Tom from operations texted, "Now I understand why you were asking all those questions in meetings. You saw this coming." The office atmosphere that morning was surreal. Employees clustered around computer screens reading news coverage, their voices hushed and their expressions ranging from disbelief to panic. The executive floor remained largely empty, with Derek, Patricia, and Michael apparently consulting with attorneys rather than managing business operations. The federal investigation had moved into high gear overnight. According to the Tribune article, IRS Criminal Investigation Division had seized thousands of financial documents and multiple computer systems. While conducting interviews with current and former employees, the scope suggested that investigators were building comprehensive cases against multiple defendants. Stock markets responded predictably to the news. Meridian's share price opened down 35% and continued falling throughout the morning as investors fled a company facing potential criminal liability. Trading volume suggested panic selling by institutional investors who couldn't afford association with corporate fraud scandals. The Human Resources Department was in crisis mode, fielding calls from employees concerned about job security and benefit continuity. Linda Martinez, who'd helped orchestrate my demotion just weeks earlier, now looked overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. The irony was perfect. The company that had punished me for ethical behavior was now facing existential threats. Because of that same ethical behavior, customer reactions were equally damaging. Meridian's largest clients began reaching out to express concern about the company's ability to fulfill contractual obligations under federal investigation. Several major contracts were reportedly under review pending resolution of the legal issues, creating immediate cash flow problems that compounded the criminal liability. Media attention intensified throughout the day. Local television stations sent crews to film outside Meridian's offices, while national business publications picked up the story as part of broader coverage about corporate tax evasion. The company's name was becoming synonymous with criminal fraud in financial news coverage. Derek's attempts to manage the crisis were pathetic and transparent. He issued a brief statement denying wrongdoing and expressing confidence that the investigation would vindicate the company's actions. But his defensive tone and obvious stress made the statement counterproductive, reinforcing public perceptions that Meridian was guilty of the allegations. "We are cooperating fully with federal authorities," Derek's statement read, "and we are confident that this investigation will demonstrate our compliance with all applicable tax laws." The lawyer-written language fooled no one. It was the kind of non-denial denial that companies issued when caught red-handed. Patricia Wells' response was even worse. She scheduled an emergency meeting with the finance team, ostensibly to address employee concerns but actually to assess potential damage from continued federal investigation. Her questions about document retention policies and employee communications suggested she was more concerned about covering up evidence than ensuring legal compliance. The meeting provided perfect insight into the conspirators' mindset. Instead of accepting responsibility for their crimes, they were focused on limiting exposure and shifting blame. Patricia actually suggested that overzealous federal agents were misunderstanding legitimate business practices, as if tax evasion could be explained away through better public relations. Michael Chin's reaction was the most telling. The CEO who'd orchestrated the entire fraud scheme was nowhere to be seen, having apparently fled to his attorney's offices to develop defense strategies. His absence sent a clear message to employees and investors that Meridian's leadership was more concerned about personal legal exposure than corporate survival. The investigation's pace suggested that federal authorities had overwhelming evidence, requiring minimal additional development. My comprehensive documentation had apparently provided investigators with everything needed to prove criminal liability, accelerating the timeline from investigation to prosecution. Local legal experts interviewed by various media outlets were unanimous in their assessment. Meridian Holdings faced devastating criminal and civil liability that would likely destroy the company, regardless of individual prosecutions. The combination of tax evasion, securities fraud, and potential racketeering charges created legal jeopardy that no corporation could survive. Employee morale collapsed as the reality of the situation became clear. Resume updates accelerated into full-scale job searches as people realized that Meridian Holdings was unlikely to survive the federal investigation. The company that had once been a prestigious employer was now a professional liability for anyone associated with it. By evening, Meridian's stock had lost 60% of its value in a single day of trading. The market's verdict was clear. Investors believed the fraud allegations were credible and the company's survival was doubtful. The financial destruction was as comprehensive as the reputational damage. I spent the evening in my Logan Square apartment, reading news coverage and social media discussions about the investigation. The public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of federal law enforcement efforts to prosecute corporate tax evasion. People were tired of wealthy executives avoiding legal obligations, while ordinary citizens faced prosecution for minor tax errors. The satisfaction I felt was profound and multifaceted. Professional vindication combined with personal revenge created a sense of justice that made months of stress and humiliation worthwhile. Derek had tried to destroy my career to protect his criminal enterprise. Instead, his retaliation had motivated me to gather evidence that was now destroying him. Tomorrow would bring new developments as the federal investigation continued. But tonight, I celebrated the knowledge that truth and justice were finally prevailing over corporate power and criminal arrogance. Derek's resignation letter, hastily typed and submitted to HR that Friday afternoon, was the final admission of guilt from a man who'd spent his career crafting elaborate lies. The single-page document cited personal reasons for his immediate departure, but everyone in the company understood that he was fleeing ahead of formal criminal charges. I was packing up my cubicle when he appeared beside my desk, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed from what looked like sleepless nights. The other employees had left early again, another consequence of the ongoing federal investigation that had made normal business operations impossible. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. I looked up from the box of personal belongings I'd been organizing, meeting his gaze with the calm confidence that came from knowing I held all the cards. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Derek. Don't play innocent with me, Olivia. I know exactly what you did." His attempt at intimidation was pathetic, given that federal agents were probably monitoring his communications and movements. The man who'd once wielded absolute power over my career was now a desperate fugitive trying to flee his own criminal enterprise. I stood up slowly, maintaining eye contact. What I did was my job. I analyzed financial records, identified irregularities, and reported my concerns through appropriate channels. The fact that your criminal activities are now under federal investigation is entirely your responsibility. His face flushed red with anger. You destroyed this company. Hundreds of people are going to lose their jobs because of your vindictive little crusade. The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. I destroyed the company? Derek, you and your conspirators stole nearly $9 million and evaded over $4 million in taxes. You created this situation through your own criminal behavior. I just documented it. Those were legitimate business arrangements, he said, his voice rising despite the obvious falseness of the claim. Complex tax strategies that someone with your limited experience couldn't possibly understand. Now I did laugh. Limited experience? Derek, I have a Northwestern MBA with a specialization in forensic accounting. I understand exactly what you did. You created shell companies to funnel money overseas and avoid US tax obligations. It's textbook money laundering disguised as consulting fees. His composure cracked completely. You self-righteous little bitch. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? My career, my reputation, my family's financial security, all destroyed because you couldn't mind your own business. The personal attack revealed how desperate he'd become. The smooth-talking executive who'd once mentored my career had devolved into a common criminal lashing out at the person who'd exposed his crimes. But his mention of my business provided the perfect opportunity to address his most damaging lie. Actually, Derek, exposing corporate fraud was exactly my business. It was my professional obligation and ethical responsibility. What wasn't your business was retaliating against me for doing my job correctly. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app, scrolling to the message thread I'd saved specifically for this moment. Would you like me to read your emails about neutralizing compliance risks and using appropriate human resources measures to silence my concerns? Because the federal investigators found those communications very interesting. His face went pale as he realized the implications. You copied confidential company emails. I documented evidence of criminal activity and illegal retaliation, which is protected under federal whistleblower statutes. Your communications with Patricia and Michael provided perfect evidence of conspiracy to commit tax evasion and criminal retaliation against a protected informant. The defeat in his expression was complete. He'd finally understood that his own arrogance had provided the evidence necessary to destroy him. Every email discussing my neutralization, every documented conversation about financial pressure, every written instruction to HR about my demotion had created an unassailable case for federal prosecution. The IRS agents were particularly interested in Patricia's email about applying sufficient financial pressure to ensure cooperation, I continued. Apparently, documenting your intent to retaliate against whistleblowers is considered strong evidence of criminal consciousness of guilt. Derek slumped against the cubicle wall, his corporate facade finally collapsing under the weight of his legal jeopardy. What do you want, Olivia? Money? A recommendation letter? I can make this worth your while if you cooperate with our legal strategy. The attempted bribery was so pathetic that I almost felt sorry for him. Derek, I don't want anything from you except accountability. You committed serious crimes and tried to destroy my career when I threatened to expose them. Now you're facing the consequences of your own choices. You have no idea what forces you've unleashed, he said, his tone becoming threatening again. Powerful people have a lot to lose if this investigation continues. Your safety isn't guaranteed just because you're cooperating with federal agents. The threat was explicit enough to be criminal, and stupid enough to demonstrate how completely he'd lost control of the situation. Are you threatening me, Derek? Because that conversation is being recorded. and threatening federal witnesses is a felony that carries additional prison time. I wasn't actually recording the conversation, but his paranoid expression suggested he believed I might be. The psychological pressure of ongoing federal investigation had clearly affected his judgment and decision-making capabilities. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The legal process takes years. You'll be looking over your shoulder for a long time. Actually, Derek, it is over. You're resigning today to avoid being terminated for cause. Federal agents have all the evidence they need to prosecute you and your co-conspirators. And I'll be testifying as a cooperating witness with full federal protection and immunity." The resignation letter in his pocket represented the end of his corporate career and the beginning of his criminal defense. The man who'd once controlled my professional destiny was now fleeing ahead of federal prosecution, his power reduced to empty threats and pathetic attempts at intimidation. As he walked away toward the elevator, I felt a profound sense of closure. The confrontation had been everything I'd hoped for, a complete role reversal, where Derek's former authority was replaced by desperate pleading and criminal liability. His resignation was acknowledgement that my evidence had destroyed his ability to continue the fraud or retaliate against me. I finished packing my belongings and prepared to leave Meridian Holdings for the final time. My career there had ended in demotion and humiliation, but my victory over Derek's criminal enterprise was complete and satisfying. The man who tried to silence me with financial pressure was now facing federal prison time, while I was positioned to receive millions in whistleblower rewards. Justice had been served with cold, methodical precision. The court documents filed 6 months after my initial whistleblower complaint represented the complete vindication of every risk I'd taken to expose Meridian Holdings' criminal enterprise. The federal indictments against Derek Martinez, Patricia Wells, and Michael Chin were comprehensive, detailed, and devastating, exactly what I'd hoped for when I first gathered evidence of their tax evasion scheme. The charges were extensive and serious. Derek faced 7 counts of conspiracy to evade taxes, 4 counts of money laundering, and 3 counts of retaliating against a federal whistleblower. Patricia was charged with 6 counts of conspiracy, 5 counts of preparing fraudulent tax documents, and 2 counts of structuring financial transactions to avoid reporting requirements. Michael faced the most serious charges: 9 counts of conspiracy, 6 counts of tax evasion, and 4 counts of racketeering under the RICO statute. The government's case was overwhelming, built largely on the evidence I'd meticulously gathered during my months of investigation. Email communications between the conspirators, financial records showing money flows to offshore accounts, and documentation of the shell company network provided prosecutors with everything needed to prove criminal intent and systematic fraud. Holdings agreed to a comprehensive settlement that included $15 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest, plus an additional $8 million in civil penalties for willful tax evasion. The company also agreed to cooperate fully with ongoing criminal prosecutions and implement extensive compliance monitoring to prevent future violations. The financial destruction was complete and permanent. Meridian's stock was delisted after falling to less than 50 cents per share, while the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to manage its legal liabilities. The prestigious tech firm that had once employed over 800 people ceased operations within 8 months of my initial whistleblower complaint. Employee reactions were mixed but generally supportive of the federal prosecution. Most understood that the criminal behavior had created an unsustainable situation that would have eventually collapsed regardless of my reporting. Tom from operations sent me a thoughtful email. "You did the right thing, Olivia. Better to face reality now than continue building careers on a foundation of lies." The media coverage was extensive and generally favorable to my decision to report the fraud. Several business publications featured articles about corporate whistleblowing, using my case as an example of how individual courage could expose systematic corruption. The Chicago Tribune published an editorial praising federal efforts to prosecute tax evasion and protect employees who reported corporate crimes. My identity as the whistleblower became public when I testified before the federal grand jury that issued the indictments. The revelation generated significant attention from other employees and industry observers who finally understood the sequence of events that had led to Meridian's destruction. Some former colleagues expressed gratitude for my courage in exposing the fraud before it could cause even greater damage. Others blamed me for the company's collapse and their resulting unemployment, though most eventually acknowledged that Derek and his co-conspirators bore primary responsibility for the criminal behavior that triggered the investigation. The personal vindication was profound and emotionally satisfying. Every humiliation I'd endured during my demotion, every condescending comment from Derek, every attempt to intimidate me into silence had been transformed into evidence of criminal retaliation that strengthened the federal prosecution. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed, aided by the comprehensive evidence I provided and the defendant's inability to mount credible defenses. Derek's attorneys attempted to characterize the offshore payments as legitimate tax planning, but their arguments collapsed when prosecutors presented email communications explicitly discussing tax evasion strategies. Patricia tried to claim she was following instructions from superiors without understanding their criminal intent, but her own emails revealed sophisticated knowledge of money laundering techniques and international tax law. Her CPA credentials actually worked against her, demonstrating professional expertise that made claims of innocent mistake implausible. Michael's defense strategy was the most desperate. His attorneys argued that he was merely implementing advice from outside tax consultants, but prosecutors showed that he had personally structured the shell company network and directed specific transactions designed to avoid U.S. tax obligations. His leadership role made him legally responsible for the entire conspiracy. The plea negotiations were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, all three defendants accepted responsibility for their crimes and agreed to cooperate with asset forfeiture efforts to recover stolen funds. Derek received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, plus $2.4 million in restitution and permanent exclusion from serving as a corporate officer. Patricia was sentenced to 5 years and $1.8 million in restitution, with suspension of her CPA license and prohibition from handling corporate finances. Michael received the harshest sentence, 12 years in prison, $4.2 million in restitution, and lifetime ban from corporate leadership roles. The sentences reflected the seriousness of their crimes and the extensive planning involved in the fraud scheme. Federal prosecutors emphasized that corporate executives who violate public trust through tax evasion and employee retaliation would face severe consequences designed to deter similar behavior by others. Asset forfeiture proceedings recovered approximately $6.8 million from offshore accounts controlled by the defendants, providing partial compensation to taxpayers who had been defrauded through the scheme. Additional civil lawsuits by shareholders and employees resulted in further financial penalties against the individuals involved. The investigation also revealed that 2 board members had received illegal payments through the shell company network, leading to additional criminal charges and civil penalties. The corruption had been more extensive than even my thorough investigation had uncovered, validating the federal decision to pursue comprehensive prosecution. Throughout the legal proceedings, I maintained my role as a cooperating witness, providing testimony and technical expertise that helped prosecutors explain complex financial transactions to judges and juries. The experience was professionally educational and personally empowering, demonstrating how individual action could trigger systemic accountability. The courtroom where Derek, Patricia, and Michael received their sentences was packed with former employees, federal agents, and media representatives who understood the broader significance of the case. Corporate tax evasion prosecutions sent important messages about legal accountability and ethical business practices. As the judge read the final sentences, I felt a profound sense of justice and closure. The people who had tried to destroy my career for ethical behavior were now facing years in federal prison for their criminal activities. The system had worked exactly as intended, protecting whistleblowers and punishing corporate fraud. The IRS reward check for $2.4 million arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 18 months after I first submitted my whistleblower complaint. The certified mail envelope seemed ordinary enough, but the Treasury Department document inside represented the complete transformation of my financial situation and professional vindication of my decision to report corporate fraud. Maria Santos called within hours of the check's delivery, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an attorney who'd successfully navigated a complex federal case to its optimal conclusion. 20% of recovered taxes and penalties, she explained. The IRS determined that your evidence was instrumental in identifying the fraud and quantifying the government's losses. The financial calculation was straightforward. Meridian Holdings had evaded $4.3 million in federal taxes through their shell company scheme, while penalties and interest brought the total recovery to $12 million. My 20% share reflected the IRS's assessment that my evidence had been essential to the successful prosecution and asset recovery, but the money represented more than financial compensation. It was official acknowledgement that my professional judgment had been correct, my ethical stance had been justified, and my courage in facing corporate retaliation had served the broader public interest. The federal government was literally paying me for having the integrity to do the right thing. The practical implications were staggering. After Maria's 25% contingency fee and tax obligations on the reward, I would net approximately $1.4 million, enough to eliminate my student loans, purchase a home, and achieve the financial independence that Derek's retaliation had threatened to destroy forever. More importantly, the reward represented complete validation of my decision to risk everything for ethical principles. Every doubt I'd experienced during the investigation, every moment of fear about career consequences, every financial stress caused by my demotion had been vindicated by the federal government's recognition of my contribution to justice. The timing was perfect for my emerging career as an independent forensic accounting consultant. Word of my role in exposing Meridian's fraud had spread throughout Chicago's financial community, creating demand for my expertise from companies seeking to strengthen their compliance programs and avoid similar scandals. 3 major consulting firms had offered me senior positions at salaries exceeding my original Meridian compensation, and I'd chosen independence over corporate employment. The IRS reward provided the financial foundation for building my own practice, focused on corporate fraud detection and whistleblower consulting. My first major client was a mid-sized manufacturing company, whose board had concerns about their CFO's offshore consulting arrangements. The engagement required exactly the skills I developed during my Meridian investigation, analyzing complex financial transactions, identifying potential fraud indicators, and documenting findings for legal review. The work was professionally satisfying in ways that routine financial analysis had never been. Every case involved protecting honest employees and shareholders from criminal executives. Every investigation contributed to corporate accountability, and every successful fraud detection potentially prevented millions in losses. Security provided by the IRS reward eliminated the economic pressures that had made my original situation so stressful. I could afford to turn down clients whose ethics seemed questionable, pursue cases based on their merit rather than their compensation, and build a practice focused on integrity rather than profit maximization. Speaking engagements became another source of income and professional satisfaction. Corporate compliance conferences wanted to hear about my experience exposing tax fraud and surviving retaliation. Law firms sought my insights about whistleblower protection and evidence gathering techniques. Business schools invited ME to discuss ethical decision-making and corporate accountability. The speaking fees were substantial, $15,000 to $25,000 per engagement, but the real value was educational and inspirational. Every presentation reached dozens of financial professionals who might face similar ethical dilemmas in their own careers. My story provided a roadmap for recognizing fraud, documenting evidence, and accessing legal protection. Media interviews extended my reach even further. Business publications featured articles about my case as an example of successful corporate whistleblowing. The Chicago Tribune published a first-person account of my experience that generated responses from readers facing similar ethical challenges in their own workplaces. The professional recognition was gratifying but unexpected. I'd never intended to become a public advocate for corporate accountability. My initial goal was simply stopping tax fraud at my employer. But the visibility created opportunities to influence corporate behavior on a much broader scale. Professional organizations began consulting me about fraud detection techniques and whistleblower protection policies. The Illinois CPA Society invited me to serve on their ethics committee. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners asked me to contribute to their training. Materials about corporate tax evasion schemes. The personal transformation was as significant as the professional one. The woman who'd been intimidated by Derek's corporate power had become someone who specialized in challenging powerful executives engaged in criminal behavior. The financial analyst who'd once feared career consequences was now sought after for expertise that could only be gained through experience with high-stakes corporate investigations. My new Lincoln Park condominium, purchased with proceeds from the IRS reward, had a spectacular view of Lake Michigan and enough space for a proper home office. The contrast with my cramped Logan Square apartment was a daily reminder of how dramatically my circumstances had changed through courage and persistence. The student loan payoff was emotionally significant beyond the financial relief. Those monthly payments had represented the burden of educational debt that limited my career options and financial flexibility. Eliminating them with proceeds from exposing corporate fraud felt like poetic justice. Derek's crimes had ultimately paid for my education, but the most satisfying aspect of the reward was knowing that my investigation had recovered millions in taxpayer money that would have otherwise been stolen through corporate fraud. The $12 million in taxes, penalties, and interest represented public resources that would fund education, infrastructure, and social services rather than enriching criminal executives. The IRS reward program had worked exactly as Congress intended when they created incentives for corporate fraud reporting. Individual citizens with specialized knowledge could expose systematic crimes that government agencies might never discover independently. My case demonstrated the program's effectiveness and encouraged other potential whistleblowers. As I deposited the reward check and watched my account balance reach levels I'd never imagined possible, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been a demoted employee facing financial hardship and professional humiliation. Now I was financially independent and professionally respected, with a career built on the very integrity that Derek had tried to punish. The business license for Williams Forensic Accounting, LLC, arrived 6 months after Derek's sentencing, marking the official beginning of my new career as an independent consultant, specializing in corporate fraud detection and whistleblower advocacy. The simple document represented complete transformation from corporate employee to entrepreneur, from victim of retaliation to champion of accountability. My office in Chicago's financial district occupied the 15th floor of a modern building, with views of the lake where I'd once gazed from Meridian's headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now working 3 blocks from where Derek had tried to destroy my career, but with complete independence and professional respect that he could never have taken away. The consulting practice had grown beyond my most optimistic projections. Word of my role exposing Meridian's tax fraud had created demand for my expertise from companies seeking to strengthen their compliance programs and attorneys representing whistleblower clients. My calendar was booked months in advance with engagements that combined substantial compensation with meaningful work. Each case brought new challenges and satisfactions. A pharmaceutical company needed analysis of suspicious research payments. A construction firm wanted investigation of potential bid rigging arrangements. A technology startup sought review of their international tax planning strategies. Every engagement involved protecting honest stakeholders from potential criminal behavior. The work was professionally fulfilling in ways that routine financial analysis had never been. Every investigation potentially prevented millions in fraud losses. Every successful detection protected innocent employees and shareholders. And every case contributed to broader corporate accountability. I'd found my calling in the intersection of financial expertise and ethical advocacy. My reputation as a whistleblower consultant had attracted clients from across the Midwest. Employees who discovered corporate fraud sought my guidance about evidence gathering, legal protection, and career consequences. Attorneys representing whistleblower clients retained me to analyze complex financial schemes and provide expert testimony in federal cases. The speaking engagements had evolved into a secondary career with national reach. Corporate compliance. Conferences, law school seminars, and professional development programs wanted to hear about my experience with high-stakes fraud detection and successful whistleblowing. The fees were substantial, but the real impact was educational. Every presentation reached professionals who might face similar ethical dilemmas. One particularly memorable engagement was at Northwestern's business school, where I addressed the same auditorium where I'd learned forensic accounting techniques that later proved essential to exposing Meridian's crimes. The students' questions were thoughtful and challenging, reflecting genuine interest in corporate ethics and accountability. How do you know when evidence gathering crosses the line into corporate espionage? Asked one MBA candidate. The question forced me to articulate the distinction between ethical documentation of crimes and improper surveillance of legitimate business activities. What career protections exist for junior employees who discover fraud by senior executives? Asked another. Her concern reflected the power dynamics that make corporate whistleblowing particularly challenging for people without established professional reputations. The media attention had stabilized into occasional interviews about corporate accountability and whistleblower protection policy. Business publications sought my perspective on high-profile fraud cases, while legal journals published my analysis of federal enforcement trends. The visibility helped establish my credibility and attract potential clients. A recent Wall Street Journal article about corporate tax evasion featured my case as an example of successful whistleblower enforcement. The piece noted that RS reward payments had increased dramatically as more employees reported tax fraud, suggesting that my experience was encouraging broader compliance with corporate accountability laws. The financial security provided by the IRS reward and consulting income had eliminated the economic vulnerabilities that Derek had exploited during his retaliation campaign. I could afford to turn down ethically questionable clients, pursue cases based on their merit rather than compensation, and maintain independence from corporate or political pressures. The personal transformation was as significant as the professional one. The woman who'd once been intimidated by Derek's corporate authority had become someone who specialized in challenging powerful executives engaged in criminal behavior. The employee who'd feared career consequences for ethical behavior was now sought after specifically for that integrity. My relationship with money had fundamentally changed. Where I'd once worried about student loan payments and apartment rent, I now thought about maximizing social impact and building sustainable wealth. The IRS reward had provided security, but the consulting practice was generating the long-term income that would fund my independence indefinitely. Community involvement had become another source of satisfaction. I served on the boards of 2 non-profit organizations focused on corporate accountability and professional ethics. The positions provided opportunities to influence policy discussions and mentor other professionals facing ethical challenges in their own careers. The speaking requests increasingly included international audiences interested in American whistleblower protection laws and corporate fraud enforcement. A recent conference in London brought together compliance professionals from across Europe who wanted to understand how individual employees could effectively challenge systematic corporate crimes. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my new career was the regular contact from employees who'd found the courage to report corporate fraud after learning about my experience. Their emails and phone calls described situations remarkably similar to what I'd faced at Meridian: systematic crimes, corporate retaliation, and personal struggles with ethical obligations. Each successful case, inspired by my example, validated the decision to risk everything for accountability. A procurement officer in Detroit exposed bid rigging that cost taxpayers millions. A financial analyst in Dallas reported securities fraud that led to executive prosecutions. A compliance manager in Seattle documented environmental violations that triggered regulatory enforcement. Their success stories demonstrated that individual courage could create systemic change when supported by appropriate legal frameworks and professional expertise. The ripple effects of my decision to expose Derek's crimes were continuing to generate accountability in corporate boardrooms across the country. As I reviewed client files in my Lakeview office that morning, exactly 2 years after my confrontation with Derek, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The woman who'd been demoted for being too honest was now professionally successful precisely because of that honesty. The employee who'd been punished for ethical behavior had built a career celebrating and protecting ethical behavior, was serving his federal prison sentence in a minimum security facility in Wisconsin, scheduled for release in 5 years with additional supervised probation. Patricia had been transferred to a facility in Kentucky after completing financial restitution requirements. Michael remained in federal custody in Illinois, facing additional state charges related to securities fraud. Their criminal convictions had permanently destroyed their ability to hold corporate leadership positions, while my role in exposing their crimes had established my reputation as a leading expert in corporate accountability. The contrast was perfect. Crime had led to imprisonment and disgrace, while integrity had generated professional success and public recognition. The business license on my office wall represented more than entrepreneurial achievement. It symbolized the transformation of personal adversity into professional purpose. Derek's attempt to silence me through retaliation had instead motivated me to develop expertise that would protect countless other employees facing similar ethical challenges. I'd learned that corporate power, no matter how intimidating, was ultimately fragile when confronted by individual courage backed by legal authority and documented evidence. The truth, methodically gathered and properly presented, could overcome any amount of corporate intimidation or financial pressure. My story had become proof that doing the right thing, even at significant personal cost, could ultimately lead to outcomes better than anything that compromise or silence might have achieved. The woman who'd been punished for being too honest had discovered that honesty, courage, and persistence were the most valuable professional assets anyone could possess.